40 acres. That's how small this fire was in its very first hour. 24 hours later, it was 2,000. By the end of the week, it was over 10,000 acres, 18 structures gone, and a body found inside a burned home on Jakima Drive. This is the hour-by-hour story of the Gann Fire, and the man Cal Fire says started it. It began on a Monday evening, the 3rd of August, in a stretch of Calaveras County that most people outside Northern California have never heard of. Valley Springs sits on the southeastern edge of New Hogan Lake, in the kind of rolling, golden foothill country that looks peaceful for 11 months of the year and turns into a tinderbox for the 12th. The grass here grows tall in spring, soaks up months of sunshine, and by early August, it is cured into something closer to kindling than vegetation. 2.5 feet of bone, dry grass, standing in the heat, waiting for a single spark. That spark came near the intersection of Hogan Dam Road and Gann Road, on the south side of the lake, sometime in the early evening hours. Within minutes, fire crews were being dispatched. Within the hour, CAL FIRE's first situation report listed the blaze at 30 acres, 0% contained, with structures already threatened and additional aircraft being requested. That's the first number in this story. 30 acres. It would not stay that small for long. By the time crews filed their next update that same evening, the fire had grown to 95 acres. Containment had climbed to 20%, a small early win that suggested this might be one of those fires that gets knocked down fast, the kind that makes the local news for a night and is forgotten by the weekend. Firefighters described a moderate rate of spread. Road closures went up around the area. Weather and terrain were already being flagged as complicating factors, but nothing yet pointed to what was coming. Crews worked through the night, building and improving control lines, trying to get ahead of a fire that was still, relatively speaking, containable. Then came the morning. There's a specific kind of dread that sets in for firefighters and residents alike when a fire holds steady through the evening hours, only to wake up. The next morning completely transformed. It's the gap between what a fire looks like at sunset and what it looks like at sunrise that tells you everything about how dangerous a night really was. Crews on the Gann Fire lived through exactly that gap. Overnight, the fire didn't just grow, it exploded. By the next situation report, the acreage had rocketed past 7,000, with containment reset back down to 10%. Read that again. In roughly 12 hours, a 95-acre fire with 20% containment became a 7,000-acre fire with 10% containment. That is not a fire that is being managed. That is a fire that is dictating terms to everyone trying to stop it. It is the kind of number that makes incident commanders reassess everything overnight, pulling in more aircraft, more crews, more equipment, because the fire has just told them in the plainest way possible that the original plan no longer applies. CAL FIRE's own reporting on this stretch called it exactly what it was: explosive growth. More than 1,500 personnel were now on scene, engines and water tenders and hand crews pouring in from surrounding units, and still the fire kept climbing. By that evening, it had passed 10,000 acres. In less than 48 hours, this fire had gone from something a single strike team might have handled to one of the largest active wildfires in the state. So what actually happened overnight? Why did a fire that seemed to be behaving suddenly stop behaving at all? The answer sits in 3 ingredients that show up again and again in California's worst wildfires, and the Gann Fire had all 3 in a lethal combination. The first is fuel. That tall grass, cured by weeks of summer heat, is about as efficient a fire carrier as nature produces. It ignites almost instantly, and because it stands upright and unbroken across the hillsides, flame can move through it in a continuous sheet rather than having to jump from patch to patch. The second ingredient is terrain. This is steep Sierra foothill country, full of drainages and slopes, and fire has a well-known and brutal relationship with a hillside. Flame climbing uphill preheats and dries out the vegetation directly above it, so the fire doesn't just spread, it accelerates, racing up slope far faster than it would ever move across flat ground. CAL FIRE repeatedly described the Gann Fire's rate of spread during this period as moderate to dangerous, with rapid uphill runs, which is about as clear a warning as an agency gives. The third ingredient is weather. Hot temperatures, low humidity, and enough air movement in those critical early hours to actively push the flames forward. Put dry grass, steep slopes, and August heat together, and you get conditions where a fire can simply outrun the people trying to stop it. There's a window in weather like that where crews cannot attack a fire head-on. All they can do is protect what's directly in front of them, hold the line where they can, and wait for the conditions to shift in their favor. That's exactly what played out here in those first critical hours, before the containment numbers finally started climbing again. And climb they did, but slowly, the way containment always does on a fire this size. From 10%, crews pushed it to 19% by Wednesday evening. The acreage had leveled off by then, holding around 10,370 acres, which told firefighters something important. The fire's most explosive phase, the overnight run that had taken it from 95 acres to 7,000, was behind them. Now it was a matter of grinding out containment line by line, ridge by ridge, in terrain that made every foot of progress hard-won. To understand what this fire actually meant on the ground, you have to look past the acreage number and into the evacuation zones, because that's where the real story of a wildfire always lives. At its peak, the evacuation area stretched from the northeastern edge of New Hogan Lake west towards San Andreas, east as far as the Calaveras County Airport, south to the Salt Spring Valley Reservoir, and right up to the edge of Angels Camp. Officials issued mandatory evacuation orders for a cluster of zones on the east side of the lake, labeled with codes like CCU 109, CCU 110, CCU 130B, CCU 139, CCU 140, and CCU 147, covering the Valley Springs area, the community of Toyon, and the ranch country that surrounds the reservoir. Warning zones ringed the mandatory orders, covering CCU 111, CCU 131, CCU 148, and CCU 153, telling residents there to be ready to leave at a moment's notice, even if they hadn't been ordered out yet. Roughly 900 residents were placed under those mandatory orders at the height of the fire, with thousands more living under the warning umbrella around them. Maps and zone codes can make an evacuation sound almost administrative, a matter of lines drawn on a screen somewhere in an emergency operations center. On the ground, it never feels that way. For the people inside those zones, the fire wasn't a number on a map. It was headlights in the driveway at 2 a.m. It was deciding in minutes what to grab and what to leave. And for the families who worked this land, it was deciding what to do about animals that couldn't just be loaded into a back seat. This is ranch country, and county officials understood that immediately. Alongside the evacuation shelter opened at the Valley Springs Veterans Memorial Building for residents and their small pets. A separate large animal shelter went up at the Calaveras County Fairgrounds in Angels Camp. A ranch pass system was created so that people who had evacuated could still get back through active road closures to feed and water livestock stranded behind the fire lines. It's a detail that's easy to skip past in a list of statistics, but it says everything about what a wildfire threatens out here. It isn't just a house, it's a herd, a flock, decades of breeding and work, a livelihood that doesn't fit in a suitcase. As the days passed and containment lines strengthened, the picture on the ground slowly began to improve. Well, on Thursday, county officials reopened 6 evacuation zones: CCU 111, CCU 110B, CCU 131, CCU 140, CCU 148, and CCU 153, shifting them from evacuation status back to open, allowing residents to return and start assessing what was left. Some roads reopened too. Pool Station Road came back open at Cement Plant Road and Highway 4, though full closures remained in place at Pool Station Road and Riata Way, and along Hogan Dam Road and Gann Road themselves, right at the fire's point of origin. It was real progress, the kind that comes only after days of exhausting, dangerous work. But for the families whose homes were gone, reopening a road doesn't undo what already happened. And what already happened, in the plainest terms Cal Fire and county officials have given, is this. As of the most recent counts, 18 structures have been destroyed by the Gann Fire, a mix of homes, commercial buildings, and other structures. That number moved during the week. It stood at 7 early on, when the fire was still in its first days of explosive growth, and it kept climbing as damage assessment teams worked their way through the burn area, confirming losses that, in some cases, hadn't even been possible to reach safely until the fire front had moved on. 2 firefighters have been injured over the course of the incident. The first injury happened on the very first night, in a bulldozer incident during initial attack operations, before the fire had even been fully sized up. The second came later in the ongoing fight to build and hold containment lines. Both were treated on scene and did not require hospitalization, which, given the terrain and the conditions these crews were operating in day and night on steep, smoke-choked hillsides, is its own kind of small mercy. Then there's the part of this story that turns a wildfire from a property disaster into something far heavier. On Thursday, personnel searching the burn area found a body inside a burned home in the 4600 block of Jakima Drive, near the town of Angels Camp. The Calaveras County Sheriff's Office confirmed the discovery. In the hours that followed, a friend of the victim came forward and identified her to local media as Susan Solari, sharing a photograph so that the woman behind the headline had a face, not just an address. For a period, investigators were careful, and rightly so, to note that the connection between her death and the fire had not yet been formally confirmed, that a separate death investigation was underway to determine cause and manner. That caution matters. It's easy for a story like this to rush to a conclusion before the facts are actually in, and it's easy, too, for the specifics of a person's life to get flattened into a single line in a wildfire update. Susan Solari was a resident of Angels Camp. someone with friends who cared enough to speak publicly on her behalf within hours of the discovery, someone whose absence is now being felt far beyond the acreage totals and containment percentages that dominate the rest of this story. But as the days went on and the county's own reporting began counting her among the incident's civilian casualties, it became clear that her death is now being treated as connected to the fire, making her the first known fatality of the Gann Fire. Somewhere, right now, there's a family that has to live with that. For a while, the cause of the fire was listed simply as under investigation, one of those frustratingly open questions that hangs over every major wildfire while crews are still focused on containment rather than origin. But that question didn't stay open. CAL FIRE investigators traced the point of ignition back to a specific piece of equipment and a specific person. According to CAL FIRE, a 65-year-old Valley Springs man named Herbert Wayne Smith was operating equipment capable of throwing sparks, specifically a grinder being used to cut metal and vegetation without following the state's fire prevention requirements for that kind of spark-producing work during fire season. Investigators determined that his actions recklessly caused the fire that would go on to burn more than 10,000 acres, destroy 18 structures, and take a woman's life. He was arrested and later posted bail, and the case remains under investigation as it moves through the legal process. Think about that gap for a second. A tool, a few sparks landing in grass that had been drying under the summer sun for months, and from that, an evacuation zone that stretched across a chunk of an entire county, a state of emergency, a governor's declaration, a FEMA grant, more than 1,600 personnel pulled from an already stretched national system, in a death that didn't have to happen. There is almost nothing proportional about that chain of events, and that disproportion is exactly why fire officials spend so much time every single summer repeating the same warnings about spark-producing equipment, warnings that can start to sound routine right up until the moment they turn out to describe precisely what happened. That single fact reframes almost everything else in the story because it turns the safety guidance that fire officials give every single season from generic advice into something with a name and a face attached. Equipment sparks, from grinders, from mowers, from trailer chains dragging on pavement, from exhaust systems and off-road vehicles, have started fires across California again and again in dry, hot conditions. It is one of the most common human causes of wildfire in this state, and it is also one of the most preventable. Clearing vegetation away from any spark-producing work, keeping water and a tool on hand while doing it, working in the cool of early morning instead of the heat of the afternoon, and checking for local burn restrictions before starting, none of that is complicated. All of it might have mattered here, and all of it will matter again the next time someone picks up a grinder, a mower, or a chainsaw on a hot, dry August afternoon somewhere in the same stretch of foothills. While the response to the ignition itself will play out in a courtroom, the response to the fire that resulted from it played out in real time across every level of government. On Tuesday afternoon, the 5th of August, Calaveras County Sheriff Rochelle Whiting proclaimed a local state of emergency for the county, citing the ongoing impacts of the Gann Fire. That proclamation isn't symbolic. It's a formal mechanism that unlocks the county's ability to request additional resources and assistance from state agencies that wouldn't otherwise be available to a jurisdiction this size fighting a fire this large. 2 days after that, Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency at the state level, authorizing the California Office of Emergency Services and other state agencies to funnel additional resources and assistance into Calaveras County. Newsom also secured a fire management assistance grant from FEMA, federal funding intended to help cover the cost of a response effort that, by that point, involved well over 1,000 personnel drawn from across the region. In the governor's own framing, that federal support strengthens the state's ability to deploy critical firefighting resources, speed up containment, protect lives and property, and support communities still living under evacuation orders. It's the kind of bureaucratic language that rarely makes headlines on its own, but behind it sits real money and real equipment. The difference between a county fighting a fire this size largely alone and a county backed by the full weight of state and federal emergency systems. The disruption reached well beyond the fire line itself. Smoke and shifting winds pushed air quality to concerning levels across the county, and the Calaveras Unified School District made the call to close its schools partially on Tuesday and completely on Wednesday, out of what the superintendent described as an abundance of caution. Smoke didn't respect the county line either. It drifted into neighboring Amador County, prompting air quality warnings there as well. A reminder that a wildfire's reach almost always extends far past its actual perimeter. By Thursday, conditions had improved enough for schools to reopen, though district officials made clear they'd continue watching air quality closely and were prepared to modify or move outdoor activities indoors if smoke rolled back in. Behind all of this sat a firefighting operation of genuine scale, one that grew almost as fast as the fire itself did. On the first night, roughly 250 personnel were on scene. Within 48 hours, that number had passed 1,500. By midweek, it had climbed past 1,600, made up of firefighters, engine crews, hand crews, and support personnel drawn from Cal Fire's Tuolumne Calaveras unit and mutual aid partners across the region. On the ground, crews had 50 engines, 8 water tenders, and 16 bulldozers cutting containment line through steep, brush-choked terrain, backed by 16 hand crews doing the grinding, physical work of clearing fuel by hand in places no vehicle could reach. Above them, 4 helicopters worked the fire from the air, part of an aviation effort that, over the course of the incident, delivered more than 500,000 gallons of water and roughly 235,000 gallons of fire retardant, dropped in careful, repeated passes along ridgelines and canyon edges where ground crews simply could not reach fast enough on their own. Aircraft logged 220 total flight hours on this fire, including nearly 45 hours of nighttime operations, some of the most demanding and dangerous flying in all of firefighting. Low, overburning mountainous terrain, in the dark, guided by infrared, and by pilots who do this work knowing exactly what the stakes are. At one point, crews carried out a firing operation along the fire's western edge, deliberately burning out unconsumed fuel ahead of the main fire's path to starve it of anything left to burn, an operation supported by helicopters flying through the night to keep it under control. It's worth pausing on the fact that none of this firepower was assembled into a system with room to spare. This fire didn't hit during a quiet stretch of the season. It hit while California was already deep into a severe fire year, with the entire country sitting at National Preparedness Level 5, the highest level there is, meaning that firefighting resources nationwide were already considered fully committed elsewhere. Every engine, every crew, every aircraft assigned to the Gann Fire was pulled from a national pool that had almost nothing left in reserve. And as if to underline exactly how primed this landscape was, the Gann Fire wasn't even the only fire burning in Calaveras County that week. A second blaze, named the Campo Fire, broke out in rural parts of the county just north of Valley Springs, near Loera Hills Road, forcing its own mandatory evacuations. It grew to around 160 acres before crews got a handle on it, reaching roughly 15% containment after a night of only minimal fire activity, even though steep terrain kept challenging the firefighters working it. Crews assigned to the Campo Fire faced the same steep slopes and dried-out grass that had made the Gann Fire so difficult to control just a few miles away, a reminder that the conditions driving these fires weren't isolated to a single hillside, but spread across the entire region. On its own, the Campo Fire is a footnote next to 10,000 acres and 18 destroyed structures. But it matters as a signal because it shows how a landscape this dry can produce multiple ignitions in the same week, each one pulling from the exact same limited pool of engines, crews, and aircraft that the bigger fire desperately needed. In conditions like these, the line between a 160-acre fire that gets caught early and a 10,000-acre fire that destroys a neighborhood can come down to nothing more than which direction the wind happened to be blowing on the day it started. Multiply that math across an entire region experiencing the same heat and the same dry fuel at the same time. And it becomes obvious why fire officials describe seasons like this one not as a string of isolated incidents, but as a single ongoing test of a firefighting system that has almost no slack left to give. By the back half of the week, the story on the Gann Fire had shifted from raw growth to grinding progress. Containment climbed from 19% to 26%, then to 33%, then 40%, and finally to 47% as crews strengthened and connected their lines across the fire's perimeter. Fire activity, which had been described as moderate to dangerous just days earlier, was now being reported as minimal, with interior fuels still smoldering in pockets, but nothing pushing outward with the intensity of those first explosive hours. Operations shifted toward what firefighters call mop-up, making impacted structures safe, clearing hazards, and hunting down remaining hotspots from the air and the ground. One area of particular focus was Heiser Canyon, where crews worked to mitigate residual heat that still posed a risk of flaring back up. PG&E crews moved in behind the fire lines to begin restoring power to communities that had been in the dark for days, and damage inspection teams continued working through the burn scar, structure by structure, confirming exactly what had and hadn't survived. Amid all of that loss, there were also, as there almost always are in these situations, small moments of something else. In Angels Camp, residents lined roadways with handmade signs and cheers for the crews working the fire, a show of appreciation that firefighters on the incident specifically noted meant a great deal to them after days of exhausting, dangerous work. It's easy for a story built entirely out of acreage totals and containment percentages to lose the human thread running underneath it, but that thread is always there, running quietly beneath every official update and every incident report, even when nobody stops to point it out. It's in the rancher who finally gets a pass to cross the checkpoint and feed animals that have been stranded for days. It's in the firefighter flying a helicopter through smoke and darkness for the 5th night in a row. It's in a school superintendent making a call about outdoor recess based on an air quality reading. And it's in a woman named Susan Solari, whose name now sits at the center of a fire that started with sparks from a grinder on a hot Monday evening. As of the most recent reporting, the Gann Fire stands at roughly 10,374 acres, 47% contained, 18 structures destroyed, 1 confirmed civilian fatality, and 2 firefighter injuries, neither of them serious enough to require hospitalization. More than 1,600 personnel remain assigned to the incident, even as containment climbs and evacuation zones continue reopening. A man has been arrested in connection with how it started. A community is beginning, slowly and unevenly, to assess what it lost and start putting itself back together, sorting through what can be salvaged and what simply can't, while insurance adjusters, county officials, and volunteers move through neighborhoods that looked completely different just a week earlier. And CAL FIRE, along with county officials, keeps repeating the same message they give after every fire like this one, not because it's new information, but because it's the kind of information that only sticks once people have watched it play out in their own backyard. Know your evacuation zone before you need it, because level 1 means be ready. Level 2 means be set to leave immediately, and level 3 means go now without waiting. Because in a fast-moving foothill, fire crews cannot guarantee door-to-door notification. Keep a go bag packed before you're told to, with medications, important documents, water, and enough supplies to last 72 hours. If you have animals, build a plan for them in advance, because that plan takes time. You will not have once the smoke is already on the hillside behind your house. And the ranchers who scrambled for a pass system this week would be the first to tell you that figuring it out after the fact is far harder than it sounds. Keep your gas tank full during fire season, because stations along evacuation routes can close or become overwhelmed exactly when you need them most. And above everything else, be careful with anything that throws a spark, because the Gann Fire is proof, in the most direct way possible, of exactly how little it takes to turn an ordinary afternoon into a disaster that spans a county, pulls in a governor and a federal agency, and costs someone their life. This is still, in every sense, a developing situation. Containment is climbing, but it isn't finished. Evacuation zones are reopening, but not all of them. Families are only just beginning to see what's left of their homes, and a legal case connected to how this all started is only in its early stages. What's certain right now is this. A fire that measured 30 acres in its first hour grew, within days, into one of the most destructive wildfires California has seen so far this season. It took a life, it displaced hundreds of families, it pulled in a sheriff, a governor, and a federal agency, and it started with something as ordinary as a grinder on a summer evening. Keep the people of Calaveras County in mind. The family that lost someone on Jakima Drive, the crews who are still out there holding lines in steep, smoke-filled terrain, the ranchers still checking on herds behind the last of the closures, and everyone across the Sierra foothills who now knows, in a way they didn't a week ago, exactly how fast 40 acres can become 10,000. And exactly how little separates an ordinary Monday evening from a disaster that reshapes a county for years to come. The Gann Fire will eventually be fully contained, the acreage number will freeze in place, and the containment percentage will finally hit 100. But for the people who lived through it, the story doesn't end there, and it never really does.